The global economy is shifting with alarming speed and in unprecedented ways as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. While the world grapples with these unforeseen challenges, Asian countries and companies are quickly adjusting to a new normal and are poised to play a vital role in maintaining a stable marketplace and world. So could the next normal emerge from Asia? Prospects and implications, that's the topic for today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of items so you know how to participate in today's event. For our audience, your setup is listen-only mode for the duration of the program. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to our speaker by using the question tab in your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect them and address them during the Q&A session in the second part of the program. Please reach out if there are any questions by emailing cpd@usc.edu. I would now like to introduce our speaker today for today's program, Jonathan Woetzel. Jonathan is a senior partner at McKinsey Company and director of the McKinsey Global Institute, where he leads research on productivity, urbanization, infrastructure, inequality, and regional economies. Based in China since 1986, he also leads McKinsey's Cities Special Initiative and co-chairs the nonprofit think tank Urban China Initiative, a collaborative project of Tsinghua University and McKinsey that aims to develop and implement solutions to China's urbanization challenge. An expert on energy, sustainability, and economic planning, Jonathan has advised national and local governments in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas on topics including improving the foreign investment environment, energy policy, and economic development. He's author of 5 books on China, including Capitalist China, Strategies for a Revolutionized Economy, and currently has 3 Amazon International Business bestsellers. And last but not least, Jonathan serves on the advisory board of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. So Jonathan, good morning. I want to first thank you for joining us today and for your support of CPD and the work we do with the broader public diplomacy community here in the United States and globally. And now more than ever, involvement and support from civic and business leaders like yourself is critically important to informing and expanding our global outlook and civil discourse. So thank you again for being with us today. So Jonathan's presentation will be followed by Q&A with our audience, and then we look forward to an informative and stimulating discussion. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Jay, and it's a pleasure. I'm glad that we have this chance to have a conversation and let's find, as they say, the opportunity in the crisis. So this is a good opportunity to talk about the world around us and what might be coming. The topic for the talk today is, as I said, could the next normal come from Asia? And so I'm going to present, I think, a view based on a perspective from Asia. I hope it's also going to be spurring some questions about what this might mean for the rest of the world. But take it in that spirit as a conversation starter and talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then I'm sure that we'll have a good round of questions. So let's start with some of the facts. And here we are. So clearly that the pandemic has had an impact and on many Asian countries, some of which seem to have controlled it and have broken the curve and flattened the curve, as it said, and reduced it to 0. Some of which are still in earlier stages. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there are some that are still looking at high rising counts on a daily basis. So we can't say for sure that Asia is through this, but it does seem like many of the countries in Asia have demonstrated a capability to respond on the health side. On the livelihood side, which is the other part of our challenge, what we're observing is a relatively quick, I wouldn't say a V-shaped, but a relatively quick bounce back. And so here, if we take the IMF's outlook for as of April 2020, what we can see is that Asia's contribution And here it's broken out in terms of China, the US, and rest of world. You can take China as partly a proxy for Asia. On the right-hand side, you can see more information related to emerging markets. But clearly, when we're looking at 2020, the only positive growth that the world will see will be coming economically, will be coming out of Asia. And a greater share of whatever growth there is in 2021 and a bounce back or recovery scenario will again be coming out of Asia. So both in terms of health and in terms of livelihood, we see Asia's contribution to the world being quite substantial. So where does that come from? We think there are basically we observe, four characteristics of the Asian response. And in many ways, we'd argue that this is, in some sense, we call it a fast forward moment, that these were trends that were already in evidence prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has brought them forward. And that as a result, that's what's underpinning this rapid and relatively effective response. And they are, in order, a revised and updated sort of sense of the social contract. If we went back to the last time we had a major crisis in Asia, whether it's the financial recession or SARS, there was a dominance of the public sector and the state. What's actually interesting about the response this time around is the level of collaboration between the private and the public sector. And this reshaping of the social contract has been an ongoing trend, much as the role of the private sector itself across Asia has been expanding. Simply as Asian companies have grown, they have more capabilities, and they're stepping up to broader social goals. Secondly, technology. Clearly, Asia is rapidly digitizing, and we can't say, of course, that there is one Asia. I mean, we have at least 4 Asias between advanced, Japan and Korea, China as its own thing, the emerging Asia in Southeast Asia, and frontier Asia, parts of the world with India and the Stans that have historically looked west, not east. They're all at different levels, but what we see across all of them is a rapid increase in the level and the use of technology. And that, of course, been a critical factor in the response here, both for health and for livelihoods. Thirdly, if we look at the economy itself, this hasn't been this response has played out differently for different countries, but also for different places and for different companies. That a lot of what's happened has been an intensification of competition, where the winner take most dynamic has played out. And that's, again, typical of Asia, that we've often had the Asian companies exist in a very high churn environment. It's very difficult to stay at the top. And all of this pandemic response has actually triggered a lot of market share shifts, where companies that were able to use technologies, places that were perceived as being better investment risks, have in turn achieved a high degree of unfair share, if you will, of the market. And the final trend is that given this sort of commonality of response and the reality that of the ongoing sort of growth of Asia as a demand center, that we've seen more regionalization. That this has, while there of course are more restrictions on travel, and this is true for every country in the world, at the same time we've seen regional collaborations in fact step up here, both on the health side and the economy side. That reflects the growing level of intra-Asian trade. Asia is almost as integrated as a region as Europe is, which is saying something, given that you think about the hundreds of years that Europe has had to become Europe. Asia, historically a set of islands, now trade is almost as intense in Asia as it is in Europe. This is saying something, and that regionalization is in turn supporting learnings, best practice sharing, and resource and collaboration across the region. So those are the 4 trends: social contract, technology, competitive intensity, and regionalization that we see characterizing the Asian response. And as I said, these are trends, so they're not entirely new, but they are a fast forward. They are bringing things forward, and that's what's driving the Asian response. So a couple of examples of what I mean in each case. So if we talk about the new social contract and 21st century corporate responsibility, everything from developing the technologies together, whether it's the QR codes or the messaging that's going on in India or Corona apps in Korea, these are public-private collaborations. Assets being repurposed, whether it's the driver pool for Grab in Singapore or the online marketplaces of Lazada, being put at the service of farmers and wholesalers to deliver food. The job fairs in Singapore, and finally, actually actions that are being taken to safeguard the company itself, whether it's masks being produced by Foxconn or coming out with complementary coronavirus insurance. But in all cases, companies have proactively stepped up to put their assets, their services, their technologies, pool them together to put them on the table as to respond to this common crisis. And that in turn has enabled a really fast response. It's very difficult to respond to things when it's only one party, either public or private, but working together, you can get those test kits done, you can check the laboratories, you can scale up the testing capacity. 23 days to scale up 96 locations in Korea. 17 days to reduce testing time from 25 hours down to 6. 24 hours to complete the surveillance down to 52 days to reduce the time to complete from 24 hours down to a much smaller number. So all of which I think goes to say that the speed that we've seen has been because we've been able to combine the public and the private systems together. It takes a high degree of social trust, but it's something that obviously Asia was able to deliver. So that's one of the first things. The second thing is this idea of the technology use. And so technologies have taken a big step up, whether it's e-commerce and the number of users, remote working apps, and how we're on a Zoom now, so this is not unique to China. Food delivery, all the rest, dramatic steps from a consumer's point of view. The Asian consumer is a relatively younger consumer. It's a much greater level of digital natives, people who have only grown up with mobiles as their preferred technology platform, and so this is this step up in some sense is a product of that, and that's accelerating consumer and industry changes. So if we look at online grocery channel behaviors during COVID versus before, and what they expect to happen after, clearly we call it omni-channel shopping is a new thing. So there's part of this next normal will be this all of the above approach, whether it's China, South Korea, India, Thailand, Indonesia. The consumer has changed, and I think we think that's going to be quite sticky, both in terms of the amount of frequency to visit online grocery and the spending that they have there. So that's going to stick. Here are a few things that may or may not stick. It's just like, what are the consumer habits that might change? And apologies for a really complicated chart, but if we look across countries, India or Korea or Japan or China, what we're seeing is some fundamental changes. I mean, there is certainly going to be an impact on travel. There's an impact on going to outdoor shopping malls or big shopping malls and attending big events. And there's going to be more of a home usage. So for whether it's entertainment or hopefully for exercise. So all those habits will be changing as a result of the pandemic, and it reflects this technology being the thing that we actually are going to spend more on, perhaps at the expense of some of these other habits. Those changes, that use of technology didn't happen by itself. Most of it happened as a result of companies moving to digital and technology platforms. And we see that in terms of how they innovated in ways to interact with the consumer. from e-commerce, and here's an example of a Chinese firm, to remote working again. So businesses really rapidly digitized in China and across the region. This shift that the consumer experienced was partly because the consumer was ready for it, but a lot was because the companies themselves were driving this, and the companies decided that this would be the time to step it up, and companies that did so gained share. We look at the cosmetics. This was typically a business which was sold in stores, and now about, for example, L'Oreal is 50% of its business is now online, and that was a massive shift. This is, of course, prompted by the underlying competitive intensity of Asia. And this is something that has been going on again for a long time. So I'll try to, this chart might take a bit of explaining. That we here on the left-hand side, what we see is economic profit compared to the number of companies. And as you can see, the top 10% of companies on the left-hand side takes most of the economic profit. And that's very interesting, of course, to say that it is it's a big opportunity to get to the top of the pile. The companies that are at the top of the pile are really the ones that are doing better. So as we look, on the other hand, that's true as in China, as it is true in Asia or anywhere else in the world. But what's interesting is if you go and look on the right-hand side, it's like, what is the percentage of the world's largest companies that actually stayed at the top over time? You'll see it's much lower in Asia and in China, and even in advanced Asia than it is, say, in North America. So this reflects the competition. It's very hard to stay at the top, in that top quintile, the top 20% in Asia, and that's because of the growth. That's because Asia's growth is not a stable, pleasant, sort of low volatility growth. Volatility is part of Asia. It has been and it will continue to be, but it's the capacity to respond to that volatility that allows you to stay or to enter that top quintile of performers. So that's a third characteristic, is that Asia will continue to be intensely competitive going forward. And the last issue that I'll raise is about decoupling, or as it's been called. I know one of the things that's a little counterintuitive is that, of course, Asia has a lot of global exposure, and that people, that there are many foreigners in Asia, myself included, this is a context where we see many, lots of trade, as we said, lots of technology imports. But what's interesting is that even as Asia is, absorbing more foreign inputs, its own market is expanding faster, which essentially means that it becomes more Asian. China becomes more Chinese, Asia becomes more Asian. And so on the left, we illustrate it with the China world exposure, where the black line is how exposed is China to the world compared to the average of all large economies. You see, back in 2000, the trend was a rising trend where China was becoming more exposed, and 2005 onwards, it's declining. And that reflects how fast China's own market is developing, as well as its own supply chain is deepening. So China relies more on China. Similar for Asia. On the other hand, if we look at the exposure of the rest of the world, the blue line, that of course had been increasing. That as China became a major manufacturer and as Asia became a major importer, all of those global economies became more connected. In the last 5 years, that has stopped. So what we've started to see is that this big integration is happening less at a global level. The global integration seems to have stalled out. And on the right-hand side, of course, what you start to see is that many countries believe that, or many companies, I should say, that this decoupling isn't impossible, that there could be more on the way. And that coincides with more countries with trade restrictions since the COVID outbreak. So clearly there's some reason to think about how trade and how globalization might evolve. So what will happen? First of all, two things: that stuff we see that's moving out of China is actually moving into Asia. So as we look at companies who have moved or plan to move manufacturing production, as you can see that there are, a fair number of them have said that some level of manufacturing, not all of it, but something might move. Where are they going? They're going to ASEAN. They're going to Southeast Asia. So that is, I think, the number one thing we see is that this might be a stall or a barrier to globalization, but it's definitely prompting more regionalization. So it's regionalization, not globalization, that we see happening. Companies that are no longer can be exposed to that tension, that risk of a global supply chain are saying, fine, we now need to serve Asia from Asia, and that includes China. So a big unanswered question will be, how does Asia collaborate? Will there be, again, one Asia, and how will it work together? And the indications on that is that we're far from pushing things aside, that the pandemic has actually brought people together. And here's a few examples of collaborations that whether it's donations of medical supplies from South Korea to Japan to China, from China to Singapore to ASEAN. So there's all of that immediate relief, but it's actually more important to think about the more structural things that are happening. Asia economy is looking at a way of establishing that as a reserve for key medical supplies in the future, saying that this shouldn't be a one-off. We should create a safety stock for the region. We should create infectious disease centers from the part of ASEAN, as for Japan and ASEAN Integration Fund. Of course, we've always had the RCEP partnership, which is about facilitating more exchanges across the commerce, logistics, production, and technological services. And finally, AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, has established a $5 billion COVID-19 crisis recovery facility for the region. And so all of this integration is likely to mean that we're going to see more of Asia in the future, that as an economic unit, this is pulling the countries, in fact, together. So I'll close with 3 takeaways and 1 question. Is that is the next normal Asian? Well, Asia's growth is likely to resume relatively quickly, though nothing is for sure. But that is the expectation, especially if we look at consumer surveys, that there is an expectation of this. There does seem to be an Asian model of response that is relatively consistent across countries. The social contract, uses of technology, the competitive intensity to provide the best competitive option for companies and for consumers, and the regional nature of this. There's a regionally collaborative approach. All of those things were in the cards before, but the pandemic seems to have pulled them forward. So this is a fast forward moment that is accelerating underlying trends. Those are 3 takeaways and 1 question. In an Asian future, where does that leave the rest of the world? How will the rest of the world deal with, integrate into an Asian economy as this pandemic passes through? How do we view that integration opportunity for the rest of the world going forward? So those are 3 takeaways, 1 question about the next normal, and love to hear your questions. Okay.
Jonathan, thank you so much. This is truly informative with all the data, and certainly a lot of on-the-ground experiences. Maybe just quickly, you sort of touched on various countries in Asia in terms of the reopening of the economy and also the consumer sentiments. I know that McKinsey has done this has been tracking global consumer sentiments. Can you say a little bit about how does Asia's consumer sentiments compare with some of the other regions and countries?
Well, I would start by saying that there isn't, again, one Asia, and that we have fairly dramatic sort of levels of optimism and pessimism across the region, with the Chinese and the Indians being on the optimistic end of things, with the Japanese being on the very pessimistic end of things. So I sense that there isn't one outlook, and that, but overall, that if we took the weighted average of it all, then yeah, Asia's more optimistic. Asia believes that the consumer spending will return to levels prior to COVID within the next 3 to 4 months. That's the weighted average of it all. But I would say that we can't treat Asia as one thing. That it is a function of the different countries. And as I said, so advanced Asia may be a little less optimistic. China pretty bullish. Emerging Asia really mixed bag, and frontier Asia actually relatively optimistic. So.
Thanks. For our audience, we are taking your questions. Please, just a reminder, please submit your questions to the question tab in your control panel. So Jonathan, we have a question from an attendee from Pakistan. And the question is, how would political frictions among states affect regional cooperation in Asia, and as well as in the context of COVID-19?
Yeah. Well, as you know, McKinsey isn't a political consulting firm, so anything I say is more from an economist or business perspective. But yeah, I mean, I think, of course, Asia, as I said, is not one Asia. That means it doesn't always get along, and that there is plenty of conflict out there. What matters is how that conflict is managed, and whether or not there is a way of dealing with problems that doesn't require an actual breakout of physical conflict or any other kind of conflict. So, but collaborative problem solving can mean a lot of disputes, and I think that that's what we're going to. The connective fabric of Asia is what we're sort of observing here. These things like creating these integration reserve mechanisms or integration forums, places to discuss issues. I mean, that's what actually is the hard work of getting along in a region. And by that measure, this pandemic again has created a little bit more connective tissue. It hasn't stopped talks. It has actually started them. And from that point of view, these political frictions are, of course, there, and they're not going to go away, but at least they'll be mediated and they'll be incorporated into a broader dialogue about how does the region develop. Now, this was a common issue. It affected everybody. And so by that token, it also created a lot of common interests, both in terms of restoring health and in livelihoods. So I'm not going to pretend that, we're going to see, peace in Asia breaks out across every dimension. Of course not. But I do think that this is actually a moment where you can put forward new collaborative opportunities in the common interest of all the countries, or the relative set of countries one is interested in.
Thank you. Can you elaborate a little bit on the regionalization trend as opposed to the globalization? So do you foresee a retreat in globalization, or it will be business as usual going forward?
Well, we think about globalization on many dimensions, and so there's trade, there's people, there's data, there's services. And the reality is that trade in physical goods as cross-border trade has plateaued since pretty much the financial recession. I mean, it bounced back to the 2008 time levels over a couple of years, and then it sort of flatlined. And now it's, of course, off a lot. People flows have continued to grow, though relatively slowly. The data, on the other hand, has exploded. And so if we think about globalization, meaning the flow of ideas and the flow of information, that's grown by almost 10 to 14 times over the last 15 years. So that's an enormous increase in globalization through data. So I would say that the death of globalization is somewhat overstated. That it is changing though, and it's also changing because typically people think about globalization as being something related to labor arbitrage or sending goods from low-cost countries to high-cost countries. And in fact, that's almost less than 20% of the total value of goods traded is that type of low-cost to high-cost country. Most of what is happening in trade and globalization is complex intermediate supply chains. And particularly in ICT, in information communications and telecoms, but everything. Your average sneaker, has over 100 parts to it, and that gets shipped around from 7 to 10 countries before it ultimately winds up in a retailer. So unwinding that kind of global value chain Well, obviously it takes a lot, it's a big investment to do that to start with. And secondly, there's a reason it's there, that it capitalized on the competitive advantage of every country. So taking it apart means either you are willing to spend a lot of money or you figured out something radically new that can change the cost equation so that people will move in that direction and make economic investment decisions. Both are possible. Obviously, tariffs change the equation. But on the other hand, markets change the equation too. And by that comparison, what we've seen is markets are growing primarily in Asia, and that's driving investment to Asia. So that globalization trend is ultimately driven by the underlying factors of where the markets are and how good are countries and places at developing competitive investment propositions. So my personal take is that we're going to see it, we're going to continue to see a flat line of the physical trade, mostly because the value in an economy is increasingly moving to services, which are generally speaking more locally provided. But that if we measure globalization in terms of the data and the ideas, well, that's not going to change at all. That's going to accelerate. One last point is finance. And finance is something that historically you've seen, at ups and downs. And the last time it was the big down was the European financial integration sort of being pulled back a lot. That's probably also going to take place to a lesser extent in Asia, mostly because it was never that financially integrated to start with. And so you might have a slight pullback on globalization from a financial perspective, but going forward, as we look at the imbalances between who's saving the money and who needs the money, that's going to be a big driver of renewed financial integration. So maybe a little bit of a drop in the short term, but in the medium term, I think that will actually accelerate as we see the savers in Japan and Korea and to some extent in China starting to deploy that capital in Southeast Asia, frontier Asia.
So here's a question. So as Asia continues on its development path, what's your thought on whether that growth will be stunned by labor and policy issues, much like in the developed countries?
Well, this gets to the question of a social contract, I think, and what is the nature of that contract between labor and consumers, as well as the companies and the government, and how, what is the give and the get? So, I think that there is clearly, of course, a challenge to raise the collective standard of living for the societies of Asia. And again, countries are at different places in this. But one thing we can say about a lot of the Asian economic development that we've seen over the last decades is that it has broadly defined lifted pretty much every boat. That most of the pieces of society have had income growth, that they've been able to accumulate wealth, and that broad indicators of social health and literacy and longevity have been increasing. Now, some places and people and cohorts have been increasing faster than others. So inequality has also increased. And that means that, so urban populations versus rural, clearly there's a gap and a growing one. The urban middle class in turn, and its ability to capture wealth through real estate and other investments is, also the wealth inequality has increased. So there is more inequality. But overall, every piece of society has seen something positive happen for the most part across Asia over the last 10 or 20 years. That frames the context for what happens next. That's one part of the context, I should say. The other part is that everything has changed in Asia. So Asia is a place that is used to a lot of volatility, whether it's urbanization and seeing the tens of millions of people move from countryside to city, or industrialization and sort of the reimagining of the workplace and occupations for the majority of the population. So Asia is pretty comfortable with transitions. I was speaking here now mostly, of course, of developing Asia, but even in advanced Asia, we've seen a relative acceptance of the reality that economies do change, and so does the workplace. As long as we're sort of taking care of at least the floor under everybody, that the floor has to be there, and we have to see a rising level for everybody. Again, maybe not all at the same time, same pace as others. That, I think, then gets you to the point of, so what happens next as we see more volatility coming? The future of work in Asia, similar to other locations, is going to depend on a new set of skills, whether it's empathetic judgment or creative intellects. I mean, these are new opportunities for the Asian workplace that we need to find new ways of achieving and invest in those skills and change those work pathways and the educational processes. All that needs to happen, and that's going to inevitably lead to some dislocations. People who have been left behind, occupations which are shrinking. As a result, you need more job transfers. That's a big challenge, but I wouldn't say, based on history, that it's anything beyond the capacity of an Asian model to adjust to. That Asian model, again, incorporating a idea that companies do have a legitimate role to play in defining the social contract and working together with the public sector, that technology will help accelerate and this can be used for the public good, and that companies in their competition in the marketplace can be used to create what China likes to call mass entrepreneurship. I mean, I think those are the things that need to be, that Asia will need to rely on, is mass entrepreneurship, the provision of sort of the floor for a social contract, and the aggressive use of technology to sustain this level of productivity growth and to make those transitions to the next economy. I mean, that's going to be the big challenge, but I think the big opportunity for Asian societies.
Well, obviously, China looms large in all of this. I have a couple of questions from the audience, specifically on China and US-China relations. So how does a potential change in US-China economic relations figure into these your potential outcomes that you just laid out?
Well, of course, the downturn in US-China relations predates COVID by quite some way. So we've been living with that context for the last year and a half at least. And as we looked at that, essentially the China and the world relationship, as I said, it's been distancing itself already. So the trade side of it, basically China trades mostly, I mean, the places that care most about China's trade and that are impacted most are in Asia, plus the resource countries, plus a few industries that are labor-intensive exports. But it's relatively concentrated from that point of view, and it's not, the US doesn't actually play that big a role. Where the US plays a big role is in technology, of course, and technology access to and the innovation from. I mean, that's critical for China and for Asia, because the US is, of course, a massive source of global innovation. So that is where I think, to the extent that we're going to see, changes in the attitudes towards sharing of technologies, of access to global markets for technologies, of obviously supply chains. I mean, that will definitely have an effect on growth in Asia and in China. But I should caution to say that a world in which we have greater technology barriers, a greater level of greater restrictions on technology flows, is a poorer, less stable, more volatile world. It's not a better world. And so it also affects the United States as much, if not more, than it affects Asia and China. So this is a little bit of a challenge. Kishore Mahbubani, in his foreign policy, would say that if one is in the US policy position, and in his article, he states that if the US policy was to improve the standard of living of the US population, it would negotiate for greater access to, but collaboration with China. If, on the other hand, it wanted to retain the US's primacy, then it would be arguing for a zero-sum world. And so those are two different points of view. We have no point of view on which one is right or wrong, or what's the appropriate policy, but they do span the boundaries of what could take place here in terms of the level of conflict and how that might affect not only China, but the world.
And related to that, can you comment or say a little bit about how does the pandemic accelerate the Belt and Road Initiative, or is presenting more challenges for that initiative?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative, first of all, I mean, it is essentially China's foreign policy. That is what it is. And it has been, I think gotten more than its fair share of media attention, if you will. And that, yes, undoubtedly, it is a policy response by the Chinese government. But if we look at the actual deployment in terms of both total amounts and its relative focus, it is simply put just not that impressive. It does create is a contribution to infrastructure in some geographies, but doesn't go anywhere close to closing what we've called the global infrastructure gap. Typically Belt and Road projects are estimated as being anywhere between 10 and $20 billion a year in investment, and the global infrastructure gap is closer to 300 billion. So it's not actually going to do that much. For individual countries and places, no doubt there are impacts. And I think in that, if anything, what we have seen is a transition from a Belt and Road, which was aimed at doing non-economic, sort of gift-based diplomacy, to something that is, frankly, very commercial. Lots of Chinese companies are in there, but they're also equally interested at this point in selling those stakes to Western banks. So very quickly, these projects have become economically driven event, and nobody wants to wind up with a multi-billion-dollar white elephant. So I wouldn't say it's a scaling back, but I do think it's been a reevaluation and a restructuring of the initiative to genuinely create investments which are actually good ideas, both from a social and an economic perspective. Does the pandemic change that? Well, to some extent, again, it brings forward the opportunity to create more regional collaboration. As you mentioned, the AIIB Crisis Recovery Facility, which is, though not a Belt and Road initiative, is indicative, I think, of the willingness to invest in infrastructure for the economies of Asia. And I think there'll be more of that. So Belt and Road does have, at this point, the opportunity to step itself up as a more region-wide collaborative initiative. That said, Belt and Road does not operate very transparently. There is very few people who will tell you what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is. Fewer people who could actually put a number on the number of projects that are in the Belt and Road. That is a big opportunity here, which China has not yet done. And so I would encourage the Chinese policymaker, from my point of view, is to say this is something that is waiting to happen. If I take one very obvious example, it's sustainability. Belt and Road is clearly in the infrastructure space. Sustainability is a huge issue. Belt and Road has not yet put out principles related to green investments standards that are commonly agreed to by the rest of the world. If it were to do so, it could create a standard which other countries, I think, would be interested in adhering to, and it certainly would create transparency about the nature of its investments and how that was contributing to sustainability. So in some ways, perhaps an opportunity that hasn't yet been fully taken advantage of, and that I look forward to seeing more from the Belt and Road in terms of both transparency and of regional collaboration.
And Jonathan, we have a few questions on sort of the implications more in the public diplomacy space. So for instance, the State Department has invested significantly in exchange programs. As an example, the Youth Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative. How should the US focus such efforts to best establish itself with its partners in ASEAN nations?
Well, there is I think one of the best and most effective things the U.S. is diplomacy for that side. Again, not speaking as much of a public policy specialist, but someone who has benefited from personally the efforts of the United States Foreign Commercial Services in my research past, is that having the on-the-ground capabilities to sort of provide resources. Certainly, advocacy is fine, but usually less effective. But just be on the ground in the locations that matter with the people that matter is the most effective form of diplomacy. And so whether it's subnational or company-based or other forms of collaboration that we could imagine, but creating that type of connective tissue of fabric is a long-term challenge, which has massive long-term and short-term benefits. That there, first of all, is always a cause that needs to be worked on, whether it's pandemic recovery, sustainability, or intellectual property. All of these causes do have impacts on local ASEAN environments. And so getting stuck in to get institutions that matter with the right people and being on the ground is a terrific way of creating that long-term benefit and addressing a near-term issue. So, I mean, I think those that type of a forum is a good place to start. But a forum by its nature is a meeting. So it's what happens between the meeting and runs up to the meeting and after the meeting that will actually make the difference in terms of building the relationship. So that type of exchange and collaboration pays off in the form of understanding the markets, getting access to the markets, predicting where the markets will grow, and so making better investment decisions. All of those things do have actual economic implications as well. So it's a good thing to do.
So what about at the subnational level? You already kind of touched on, at the city level, in public diplomacy discussion, we have this notion of city diplomacy. So how does subnational actors, their collaboration with each other, for instance, in the Asia region, sets an example of collaboration across nations? And have you seen any good examples of that, whether it's during the COVID situation or prior to that?
Well, there are some subnational collaborations globally. So whether it's the C40 or ICLE or a number of other sort of multilateral sort of organizations that try to bring cities in some sense states together. What's also kind of maybe it's not entirely unique, but there is certainly a big part of what happens in Asia is the city diplomacy. So obviously city states like Singapore, of course, but also a Hong Kong sort of as a special zone, and a Seoul as a mega city, or Tokyo have certainly Seoul has ambassadors that go around the world representing the city, not necessarily the country. So this is an interesting way of sort of seeing people reach out to target communities. A lot of what happens from a China side, of course, is there's a bucket of sister cities, but cities in Asia, I wouldn't say entirely, but I mean, because in India it's probably more provinces or states that have the economic responsibility, but they do take that subnational level does take more initiative to set its own policies, whether it's around foreign investment or labor, market access, even technology development, because they have scale. And cities and subnational entities in Asia typically are bigger than they are in Western world. They have more capabilities. So they can, in fact, launch that ambassadorship, and they can create that special economic zone, or they can, build a university if needed to create an exchange platform. All those things happen. And I think that therefore creates a much bigger playing field for the rest of the world. I think that there's always a scale issue. So, how does an Iceland deal with a Shanghai? I mean, it's like literally, order of magnitude in a population between a country and a city. But then you zero in on where is actually the opportunity for one side or the other to bring competitive advantages and special knowledge and skills. In the case of Iceland, a lot to do with sustainability that Shanghai can benefit from. So in a way, it's an opportunity for the world to leverage its skills and capabilities by bringing them into a fast-growing, bigger context, and for that context itself of Asian subnationals to benefit from those technologies and that learning and skills.
You just mentioned India. So how does India fit into all of this in both the Asian context, also vis-a-vis China's development?
Well, I mean, I think India, of course, has its own path and is following it. And from a macroeconomic perspective, we could, draw parallels about the process of urbanization and the growth in savings rates, which are underpinning, all the successful models of economic development that we've seen globally. So that's, in that sense, India follows the global pattern of urbanization and capital accumulation and productivity growth being the things that make a difference to raising the standard of living of the Indian people. In that context, India has now become more Asian, if you will, in terms of its direction of trade. Historically, and still today, India still largely looks more west than it does east, but that is changing. So that it is, the growth in its trade and its investment, both outward and inward, and its technologies, are definitely towards the east, towards Asia, not as opposed to Europe and North America. So that is an interesting trend. We think it again marks that growing collaborative, the growing anchor of Asia, if you will, the idea that Asia is the largest market for the global economy. Now within India, of course, it has its own political and economic system. And that reflects the realities of its history and of its endowment and of its people. So we wouldn't be, we'd be remiss to try to, or confused to try to just sort of copy China and stick it on India and say it's the same thing. Of course not. What I observe in India, of course, is that the biggest difference is the private sector has a much greater and established role, particularly family-owned companies. And that is, again, a context issue. It is also a much more, if you will, diverse country with a great variety of languages in the way which other Asian countries have less of. And so all of this means that you will see a lot more patterns emerge that are more competitive or less over time. And there's a lot of volatility, and that has to be not equaled out, but that has to be taken into account as it grows. So I'm sure that India, in that sense, at the macro level, follows the same pattern, but at the micro, we'll see a lot more, again, successes and failures. Some places doing very well for a period of time, and then losing the plot and falling off. But overall, because of the macro success, we're going to see more integration. Integration, as I said, not necessarily always physically, but from technology, from finance, and from people, this over time will grow. And with that, the opportunity, the challenge of conflict, but the opportunity for collaboration.
So if there is such a thing as a generalized Asian model, I mean, as you mentioned, there are also different, Asias in a way, but let's just say there is one generalized Asian model. Could this model benefit other global geographies?
I think we have to take each place on its own. A very wise woman one time told me it's a shame. It's not a good idea to compare because you lose the best of both. So I would, I think that one has to observe what is working about the model and say, could it apply here? And so we've defined, these aspects of the social contract and the willingness of the companies to collaborate with the government and their capabilities to do so. Maybe there's something there about how does one, in a Western context, crowd in private capital? How does one bring private capital into areas which have historically been viewed as being only for public or social capital? Affordable housing comes to mind, as well as healthcare and education, saying what are the things that one can do to enable the private sector to participate more fully? Technology is obviously, something that is an opportunity for everybody, but how we choose to use it depends a lot on our views on what are the co-benefits and what are the consequences, including potentially loss of privacy, including the risks of bias, and whether it's algorithmic bias or political bias. So these things vary from country to country, and I think that's a really important question, not to assume that every technology package could be equally applied everywhere. That's a problem that many technology companies face, and a challenge for them is they assume in many ways a one-size-fits-all and a scalable model, and that isn't always true. So even with something like ride sharing or home sharing, that these are the rules and the expectations of countries and populations are very different. So the use of technology, yes. How we use it and the concerns, not necessarily so. And then as we get to the other aspects in terms of the competitive intensity and the regionalization, I think that those are very, again, the competitive intensity driven a bit by the capacity to compete maybe, but in general, that's the basis of a market economy. So we'd like to think that, that this level of churn and this level of intensive competition, we demonstrate it's possible. And the question being like, why hasn't that happened? Why are the same companies leading the pack in the US today as did 20 years ago? Why is that? I mean, it's not all the same. Of course, you have a new set of competitors from technology, but it's more the same than in Asia. So why is that? And that's a good question to ask. Likewise, finally, regionalization. We've demonstrated it seems to be a consequence or an opportunity that to bring the region together to create more collaboration. That's true for Asia at a regional level. I think it's also true at a local level. If we see challenges in urbanization between big cities and small cities typically grow only if they are connected to big cities. So this capacity to integrate, to collaborate across boundaries may be something that we're missing in Asia, in the rest of the world. By bringing together the small and the big, by investing in literally infrastructure to do so, but also addressing sort of boundaries which have existed for hundreds of years, which may not be relevant anymore, we can create more vibrant metropolises and bigger societies that create more opportunities for people and for investors. So I think those are some of the ways in which the Asian experience and Asian model might be applicable in the rest of the world.
Thank you. We are almost coming to the end of the program. I would like to just ask these two final questions. So the one, if you could comment quickly if you have any suggestions for European and American businesses going forward in their, whether it's marketing or branding strategies, given the future emergence of Asia and how that is going to impact the global economy, but also the regional economy in that part of the world. So any suggestions to American and European businesses?
Well, I think that we've seen, as I said, the consumer of the future is a younger, more technologically adept and Asian consumer. And so as we think about branding and marketing exercises, it may be good to start from the consumer back and starting to use Asia as a platform for understanding those trends. I think as we think about global consumer markets, there are basically two global markets that dominate or that account for a majority of consumer growth. And those are Asian working consumers between the ages of 20 and 40 or so, and Western retired consumers over the age of 50. So it sort of depends a bit on where you are, of course. If you're marketing to somebody who is retired and that's what your focus is, then, which might be true for a lot of healthcare, for example, well then, Asia will have some relevance, but maybe not as much. But if you're looking at, the consumer space and to discretionary spending, then Asia is very, very relevant for everything from entertainment to communications and technology to automotive. So in that sense, being aware of, present in, and leading in the Asian market isn't really an option. It's sort of life or death, which means drives you to, of course, this idea of technology. This Asian branding and marketing is technology. It's omni-channel. It's 24/7, 365, and the building of that architecture and the engagement in the ecosystem around it with all of the partners in Asia, is life or death to a consumer company here. And it's very possible to do so. As I said, I mentioned L'Oreal, which is a good example on the cosmetics side. There are others. In fact, multinationals have done very well in Asia for decades, if not centuries. And that's not going to change, one hopes, because they'll do their same thing they've done before, which is buckle down, invest in the understanding the marketplace and serving those consumers, recognizing that that will, in many industries, be this trend-setting consumer for the world.
All right. So final question, very short answer. We're going to go back to the title and the theme of today's conversation. Can you define what you mean by the next normal, or what is the next normal?
I'm an optimist, Jay. So I like to think of what we can learn from this and how we can put it to use. And so in my view, the next normal, as it comes from Asia, is a greater level of a stronger social contract, a recognition that private and public working together creates a better outcome, a push forward on technology where it permeates every aspect of our lives and allows us to achieve the benefits of safety, of convenience, of employment that we need, a step up in competitive intensity where we don't allow the products of the past to outweigh the promise of the future, and finally, a greater level of collaboration across borders. I think that should be the new normal. I hope it will be, because I think that brings us to a better place. Now, if we take an analogy though, when you apply force to a system, you have one of two responses. Either the system speeds up or it breaks apart. The things I've mentioned, that represents, as I said, a fast forward, an acceleration of Asia. When the pandemic hit, it accelerated the trends and that accelerated the growth. So it's actually been a forward motion. A crisis can also fragment. It can pull people apart. It can break the systems. That's the question we have for the rest of the world. Will this crisis break our system, or will it allow us to fast forward by recognizing this new model and what it brings to us?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for the insightful discussion, and thank you everyone for attending today's program. And once you leave the program, you'll receive a survey on the event, and we'd appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback. So on behalf of CPD, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.